In April 2000, the bustling city of Miami became the backdrop for a crime so shocking it would haunt the state of Florida for decades. Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old production assistant at the Miami Herald, was just taking her usual lunch break, parked in her van, reading quietly by the water. She didn't know that a chance encounter with a stranger, a 23-year-old drifter named Michael Anthony Tanzi, would seal her fate. What happened next was unimaginable. Abduction, hours of terror, a drive deep into the Florida Keys that would end with violence so brutal it would forever scar a community. For 25 years, Tanzi sat on Florida's death row, his case twisting through courtrooms and legal battles, until the state finally carried out its ultimate sentence. And when the time came, his final words were not for himself, but for the family of the woman whose life he had taken. To understand how a routine lunch break became a moment of horror, and how a killer's journey ended in a quiet chamber at Florida State Prison, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a story that doesn't just haunt Miami, it haunts everyone who hears it. Background of the victim and perpetrator. Janet Acosta. Warm, sunlit family photos of Janet with relatives at birthdays and barbecues. Slow pans across her desk at the Miami Herald, stacks of newspapers and coffee mugs neatly arranged. A serene shot of Watson Island, the water shimmering under the midday sun, where she often parked during lunch. Michael Tanzi. Faded childhood photos of a young boy with a hollow stare, interspersed with juvenile record documents and grainy mugshots. Scenes of the Florida Keys, palm trees, lonely highways, and rundown motels, flashing across the screen as somber music plays. To understand the story, you have to start with two very different lives that would cross paths in the worst way imaginable. Janet Acosta was 49 years old, a quiet but well-loved production assistant at the Miami Herald. For over 2 decades, she worked behind the scenes, ensuring the city's paper was ready for the presses each night. Her coworkers described her as kind, dependable, and fiercely loyal to her family. She was the type of person who never forgot a birthday, who always picked up the phone when someone needed to talk. Away from work, Janet found comfort in simple routines. Every lunch break, she'd drive to scenic spots near Watson Island, park her van by the water, and lose herself in a paperback novel, a brief escape from the fast pace of the city. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. She was, by every account, a woman simply living her life, quietly and peacefully, until the day violence found her. On the other side of this story is Michael Anthony Tanzi. Born February 27, 1977, Tanzi grew up in an environment marked by chaos and neglect. Abuse and instability shadowed his childhood, shaping a boy who would struggle to find direction or purpose. By his teenage years, trouble had already found him: petty theft, drug use, and brushes with the law that sent him drifting from one juvenile facility to another. By the late 1990s, Tanzi had settled into a transient life, drifting through the Florida Keys. Locals described him as a loner, someone who floated in and out of communities without ever staying long enough to leave an impression. But under that quiet exterior, there was a darkness growing. The petty crimes escalated: thefts, threats, violent outbursts, warning signs of a man spiraling out of control. 2 lives, 2 very different paths, would tragically collide on a warm spring afternoon in April of 2000. One woman seeking a moment of peace on her lunch break. One man driven by chaos, anger, and opportunity. And in that collision, a crime so brutal would unfold that it would not only devastate a family, but haunt an entire community for the next 25 years. The crime, April 25, 2000. Establishing a shot of Watson Island on a bright April afternoon, the water glistening, palm trees swaying gently in the breeze. A reenactment of Janet sitting in her van, book in hand, the world quiet around her. Close-up of a man's shadow creeping along the side of the van, building tension. Police evidence maps with a red line tracing the route southbound, following the path toward the Florida Keys. Surveillance stills from ATM cameras, grainy black and white images of a terrified woman in the passenger seat and a man hunched over, withdrawing cash. April 25, 2000. It was a Tuesday like any other in the bustling city of Miami. For Janet Acosta, it was just another lunch break, a quiet escape from the noise of the newsroom. She parked her van at the Japanese Gardens on Watson Island, a peaceful spot she had visited countless times before, and opened her book. It was supposed to be her time to relax, to read, to breathe. But within minutes, that quiet moment would shatter. From the shadows came a man she had never seen before. 23-year-old Michael Anthony Tanzi, tall, lean, and drifting through life with nowhere to be and nothing to lose, approached her van. He asked for a cigarette, then the time, his voice calm, but his eyes fixed. And then, without warning, the first blow landed. A sudden, violent punch that stunned Janet and knocked the book from her hands. In a flash, Tanzi forced his way into the van, taking control of the wheel and driving off the island as her nightmare began. As the Miami skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, Tanzi's demands grew darker. He threatened her with a razor blade, pressing the edge of cold steel against her skin as he barked instructions. Duct tape wrapped tightly around her wrists and across her mouth left her bound, gagged, and helpless in the passenger seat. She was no longer on her lunch break. She was a captive in her own van. Southbound on US 1, Tanzi made stop after stop, using Janet's bank card to withdraw cash from ATMs. Every withdrawal, every stop, was captured on surveillance cameras. Grainy, black and white footage of a terrified woman sitting silently beside her abductor, her eyes wide with fear. Witnesses would later recall seeing the van idling near gas stations and convenience stores, but no one knew the horror unfolding inside. With each mile, the distance between safety and terror grew. Miami's bustling streets gave way to the quiet, winding roads of the Florida Keys. Palm trees blurred by as the van barreled through Key Largo, Marathon, and beyond. Inside, the fear was suffocating. Tanzi's rage simmered just below the surface, his voice shifting between quiet control and explosive anger. Janet, gagged and restrained, could do nothing but sit and wait, hoping for some chance, any chance to escape. But there would be no escape. The drive would stretch on for hours, the world outside oblivious as a life hung in the balance. By the time the van reached Cudjoe Key, that balance would tip into unimaginable violence. The murder. Aerial drone footage sweeping over the remote, marshy stretches of Cudjoe Key, isolated and silent, with narrow roads cutting through mangrove thickets. Faded crime scene photos, blurred where necessary, showing the dense woods where Janet's body was later recovered. Interview clips of Monroe County deputies, their voices steady but somber as they recall the crime. Overlays of official police documents and evidence bags marked with the date, April 25, 2000. By the time the van reached Cudjoe Key, the sun was dipping low, casting long, haunting shadows over the narrow, winding roads. This quiet island, more than 120 miles south of Miami, was far removed from the world Janet Acosta knew, far removed from help, from safety, from any chance of rescue. The isolation was complete, and, for Janet, it was the beginning of the end. In that desolate corner of the Florida Keys, with the hum of cicadas filling the air and the stillness of the mangroves pressing in, Michael Anthony Tanzi made his final, brutal decision. Pulling off the road, he dragged Janet into a secluded patch of woods, her hands bound, her voice muffled beneath layers of duct tape. There, among the tangled brush and silence of the island, he ended her life. Investigators would later determine that Tanzi strangled her, the pressure so fierce and prolonged that the injuries left no doubt about the violence of her final moments. With chilling precision, he reinforced the tape over her mouth, nose, and eyes, ensuring there would be no breath, no sound, no chance of survival. Forensic teams would later describe the scene in painstaking detail: the disturbed earth, the scattered leaves, the signs of a desperate struggle. And yet, in those final moments, Janet was utterly alone, her last breaths silenced under the canopy of the trees, her final thoughts known only to her. With the crime committed, Tanzi showed no sign of remorse. He left Janet's body there, hidden in the woods, her van now his escape vehicle. Driving away from the secluded Key and heading further south toward Key West, he carried with him the stolen cash, the receipts from the ATMs, and the weight of a life he had just extinguished. Later, Monroe County deputies would recall the sheer brutality of the crime. In interviews, seasoned investigators, men and women hardened by decades of law enforcement work, admitted they had rarely seen such cold, calculated violence. The remoteness of Cudjoe Key, they said, gave Tanzi the time and isolation to act without interruption, and that isolation would haunt the investigative team as they worked tirelessly to bring Janet home to her family. It would not be until the following day, under the sweltering Florida sun, that law enforcement, guided by Tanzi's own confession, would recover Janet Acosta's body from that quiet, wooded patch. But on the night of April 25, 2000, the van carrying her killer rolled silently through the streets of Key West, the engine humming, the crime already committed, and the life of a kind, innocent woman violently stolen. Arrest and confession. Wide shot of Key West's quiet streets at night. Flashing police lights illuminating palm-lined roads. Archival dashcam footage of patrol cars during the arrest. Blurred for privacy, but haunting in tone. Inside the Key West Police Department, a stark interrogation room recreation, a single metal table, a recorder light blinking red, and a man slouched in his chair. Booking photos of a disheveled Tanzi, eyes vacant, his face expressionless as deputies process him. Close-ups of evidence photos, Janet's ATM card, crumpled withdrawal receipts, and personal belongings from her purse spread neatly on an evidence table. As the clock crept past midnight on April 26, 2000, the quiet tourist streets of Key West were interrupted by flashing lights and the low hum of police radios. Hours after abandoning Janet Acosta's body in a wooded patch of Cudjoe Key, 23-year-old Michael Anthony Tanzi drove aimlessly through the narrow streets of Key West in the very van that had become both a prison and a crime scene. Alert officers, responding to a countywide bulletin describing the vehicle and its missing owner, spotted the van parked near Duval Street. Within moments, multiple patrol units converged, boxing him in under the dim glow of street lamps. The arrest was swift and silent. Officers approached with weapons drawn, ordering Tanzi out of the vehicle. When he stepped from the driver's seat, his clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his demeanor eerily calm. Inside the van, investigators quickly found the items that would seal the case. Janet's purse, her bank card, crumpled ATM receipts documenting the withdrawals made during the hours of her captivity, and scattered personal belongings, silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded. At the Key West Police Department, the interrogation began. Inside the small, sterile room, with only the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, detectives pressed for answers. At first, Tanzi sat quietly, eyes downcast, his voice barely audible as he recounted vague details. But as the hours passed and the weight of evidence grew heavier, his story spilled out, a chilling, emotionless confession. He admitted approaching Janet on Watson Island, striking her, binding her, and driving her south. He spoke in a flat, detached tone about using her ATM card at multiple stops, about the drive through the Keys, and finally, about that remote, wooded stretch on Cudjoe Key where he strangled her and left her lifeless body behind. Detectives later recalled the moment with unease. One veteran investigator described Tanzi as almost robotic, recounting the crime with a chilling lack of emotion, as though he were describing a routine errand instead of a brutal murder. But within his confession were the directions investigators needed. Clear, precise details that led Monroe County deputies to the exact location of Janet's remains. By dawn, the crime scene on Cudjoe Key was alive with law enforcement. Deputies combed through dense brush as crime scene technicians marked evidence, photographed the site, and carefully recovered Janet's body. Across the Keys and in Miami, news of the arrest spread quickly. sending shockwaves through the community and leaving her family grappling with the unimaginable reality of their loss. In the days that followed, Tanzi's booking photos and court documents became front-page headlines. The face of a 23-year-old drifter stared back at the city of Miami, a stark reminder of how quickly a single, senseless act of violence could forever alter so many lives. The trial and sentencing. Exterior of the Miami-Dade County Courthouse, its stone facade standing solemn under the Florida sun, with slow zooms on courthouse steps crowded by reporters. Archival courtroom sketches showing Tanzi seated, head lowered, flanked by his defense attorneys. Newspaper clippings with bold headlines. Tanzi pleads guilty. Killer faces death. Shots of prosecutors presenting evidence. ATM footage, crime scene diagrams, and photographs of Janet Acosta projected for the jury. Close-ups of Janet's family sitting silently in the gallery, grief etched into their faces as the proceedings unfold. By 2003, 3 long years after Janet Acosta's life was stolen, the weight of evidence against Michael Anthony Tanzi was undeniable. Inside the Miami-Dade County Courthouse, the walls seemed to hum with quiet tension as families, reporters, and law enforcement crowded the gallery for what would become one of the most closely watched trials of the decade. Tanzi, now 26, entered the courtroom wearing a county-issued jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, his eyes fixed downward, avoiding the gaze of Janet's grieving family. In an unexpected move, Tanzi pleaded guilty to every charge laid before him: first-degree murder, carjacking, kidnapping, and armed robbery. His legal team offered no defense, acknowledging that the overwhelming physical evidence, the ATM footage, the forensic links to the van, his own detailed confession, left no path for acquittal. Yet even with the guilty plea, the penalty phase unfolded like a grim narrative of escalating violence. Prosecutors painted Tanzi as a fledgling serial killer, presenting records of his troubled past, his drifting through the Keys, and a chilling pattern of crimes that they argued were inching towards something far worse. For the jury, the evidence was devastating. They sat stone-faced as they listened to investigators recount the final hours of Janet's life and watched the surveillance footage that chronicled the harrowing journey from Watson Island to the Florida Keys. Every frame of that grainy video, Janet's terrified face illuminated by the glow of an ATM screen, served as a silent plea for justice. When the time came to deliberate, the jury returned swiftly, their decision unanimous: death. In a quiet but firm voice, the foreman read the recommendation, each word echoing through the hushed courtroom. Moments later, the judge affirmed the verdict, sentencing Michael Anthony Tanzi to death for the murder of Janet Acosta, with additional consecutive life sentences for the kidnapping, carjacking, and armed robbery. In the courtroom, Janet's family held each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces as the man who had destroyed their lives was led away in chains. Outside the courthouse, prosecutors addressed the media, calling the outcome a necessary measure of justice while acknowledging that no sentence, not even death, could ever undo the horror of April 25, 2000. For the community, the case became a painful reminder of the fragility of life. And for Tanzi, it marked the beginning of a 25-year descent through the appeals and isolation of Florida's death row. The long road of appeals. Aerial shots of Florida State Prison, razor wire glinting under a blazing summer sun, then fading into dimly lit hallways lined with heavy steel doors. Stacks of legal documents and appeals briefs spread across cluttered desks, pages stamped with "denied" in bold red letters. Archival news footage of legal analysts discussing Florida's death penalty system and pivotal cases like Ring versus Arizona. Close-ups of Michael Tanzi in the death row visiting room. Older, heavier, his once youthful face hardened by decades of isolation. Somber shots of Janet Acosta's family leaving courtrooms, year after year, carrying framed photographs of their daughter and sister. What followed Tanzi's death sentence was a legal odyssey that would stretch across a quarter of a century, a relentless cycle of appeals and denials that kept the name Michael Anthony Tanzi alive in court records long after the horror of April 25, 2000. From his cell on Florida's death row, a stark, concrete box barely the size of a walk-in closet, Tanzi began the slow, methodical process of challenging his conviction and sentence. His attorneys filed motion after motion, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel during the penalty phase, claiming that crucial mitigating evidence about his abusive childhood and history of psychological trauma had never been fully explored before the jury. As the years ticked by, the legal landscape shifted. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Ring v. Arizona called into question the role of juries in recommending death sentences, giving defense teams across the country fresh ammunition for appeals. Tanzi's lawyers seized on the precedent, arguing that Florida's sentencing scheme was unconstitutional and that his death sentence should be vacated. But time and again, state and federal courts pushed back, issuing terse, devastating rejections. The rulings emphasized the overwhelming evidence of guilt, the brutality of the crime, and the unshakable conclusion that the jury's unanimous decision met every legal threshold required. Throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, Tanzi's case wound through the labyrinth of appellate courts, each petition dissecting procedural errors, citing evolving standards of decency, or highlighting his deteriorating mental and physical health. In his final years, his lawyers argued that decades of isolation on death row, combined with obesity, sciatica, and other chronic conditions, could cause serious complications during lethal injection, potentially leading to an inhumane execution. Those arguments, like all the others before them, were swiftly denied. For Janet Acosta's family, every new filing was a fresh wound, reopening the trauma they had lived with since that spring afternoon in 2000. To them, the appeals were not just legal documents, but prolonged reminders that justice for Janet had been delayed, year after agonizing year. By the summer of 2025, the final stays had been lifted, the last doors to clemency closed. After more than 2 decades of battles and procedural delays, the date was set. Michael Anthony Tanzi would be executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. There would be no more appeals. No more delays, only the quiet, inevitable countdown to an end that had been 25 years in the making. Final hours before execution. A slow pan across the gates of Florida State Prison. The early morning sky still dark, only the faint glow of security lights breaking the silence. Animated timeline graphics showing each hour leading up to the execution, with timestamps glowing against a black background. Muted footage of reporters gathering outside the prison, tripods and cameras aimed at the guarded entrance as news vans hum quietly in the dawn. Inside, somber shots of the prison interior, a stark concrete corridor, a heavy steel door sliding shut, and the narrow window of the death chamber. Black and white stills of Tanzi in his final years on death row, overlaid with his Department of Corrections inmate number, slowly dissolving as the narration builds. April 8, 2025. After nearly 25 years on Florida's death row, Michael Anthony Tanzi woke to his final sunrise at precisely 4:45 a.m. The prison was quiet, heavy with the anticipation of what the day would bring. Guards moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing down the long, sterile corridors that had been his world for more than 2 decades. As the lights flickered on in his cell, Tanzi sat silently on the edge of his cot, staring at the bare concrete walls before bowing his head in prayer. At 5:30 a.m., he met with his spiritual advisor, a soft-spoken minister who had visited him weekly for years. Behind the thick glass of the visitation room, the two spoke in hushed tones, their words muffled but their expressions somber, a final conversation about redemption, forgiveness, and what awaited him on the other side of that chamber door. The hours slipped by quietly, marked only by the occasional clang of a cell door and the hushed whispers of correctional officers preparing for the state's ultimate punishment. At 10 a.m., Tanzi was escorted to a small holding cell just steps away from the execution chamber. It was here, in this final space, that he was given his last meal, a meal he had chosen carefully, one that spoke more of comfort than extravagance. A thick pork chop, several strips of crispy bacon, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, a generous serving of corn, a scoop of vanilla ice cream, a candy bar, and a cold soda. He ate slowly, methodically, savoring each bite as if stretching out the fleeting minutes of his life, pausing occasionally to glance toward the narrow window that framed a pale slice of the Florida sky. By early afternoon, the small groups had gathered outside the gates of Florida State Prison. Reporters, activists, and a handful of silent protesters holding hand-painted signs calling for the end of capital punishment. Inside, the warden moved through the final checklist, ensuring every procedure was in place. Inmates on the row fell silent, aware of the grim reality unfolding just a few cells away. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with the stillness that only comes when time is running out. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the horizon in shades of gold and gray, the clock continued its steady march towards 6 p.m. inside the holding cell. Tanzi sat quietly, hands folded, waiting for the footsteps that would come to take him to the chamber. The footsteps that would signal the end of a story that began in violence and chaos 25 years earlier. The execution. Wide shot of the Florida State Prison exterior, bathed in the dim light of early evening, as camera crews adjust their lenses and satellite vans line the narrow road outside. Split-screen footage, one side showing the prison gates, guarded and still, the other side capturing the solemn candlelight vigil across the street, where family members, activists, and quiet onlookers stand in silence holding flickering candles. Inside the chamber, a sterile, clinical room with a stark white gurney under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Close-up of the thick leather straps buckled across the wrists, ankles, and chest. Archived courtroom sketches flash across the screen, overlaid with headlines from 2000 to 2025, tracing the long road that led to this moment. At exactly 6 p.m., the heavy steel door of the execution chamber at Florida State Prison swung open. Michael Anthony Tanzi, now 48 years old, was escorted in by a team of officers, his expression calm but distant, as if already halfway gone. He was guided onto the narrow gurney, his arms resting stiffly by his sides, as the leather straps were tightened across his wrists, ankles, and chest, the final restraints in a life that had been defined by violence, chaos, and, ultimately, consequence. Beyond the glass partition, a small group of witnesses, journalists, state officials, and members of Janet Acosta's family, sat in silence, their faces heavy with a mixture of grief and quiet resolve. In the corner of the chamber, the chaplain stood with a worn Bible clutched in his hands, murmuring quiet prayers as the 4 lines were inserted with clinical precision, one needle in each arm, feeding into the network of tubes that led to the machine behind the wall. When the warden gave the signal, Tanzi was asked if he had any final words. His voice, quiet but steady, carried across the sterile room. "I want to apologize to the family," he said, pausing briefly before reciting a soft, trembling Bible verse, a passage about mercy and forgiveness, his eyes closing as the words faded into the hum of the chamber. At 6:10 p.m., the first chemical flowed through the 4 lines, his chest rising and falling once, twice, and then slowing as the second and third injections followed a methodical sequence. By 6:12 p.m., the physician standing silently to the side leaned forward, checked for a pulse, and gave a simple, clinical nod. Michael Anthony Tanzi was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m., 2 decades and 5 years after the April afternoon when Janet Acosta's life was stolen. Outside the prison gates, protesters held their signs a little higher as cameras rolled, some chanting for justice, others calling for an end to capital punishment. Across the street, the candlelight vigil flickered in the cooling evening air, their silent prayers rising like smoke into the Florida night, a somber reminder that in the end, there are no winners in a story written in violence and loss. Call to action. Slow fade from the flickering candlelight vigil to a black screen, the Crime Report Network logo glowing softly in the center. Montage of previous documentaries, quick flashes of crime scene photos, courtroom sketches, and prison gates, set against a moody but reflective background score. Final frame, the words justice, memory, truth, appear on screen before fading into the channel subscribe button animation. If you found this documentary as powerful and thought-provoking as we did, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to Crime Report Network for more in-depth, jaw-dropping true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of human nature and the long road to justice. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that justice was truly served in this case? Or does the story of Michael Anthony Tanzi and Janet Acosta raise deeper questions about crime, punishment, and the pursuit of closure? Your voice matters, and your perspective helps keep these stories alive, honoring the victims and examining the systems that shape their fates. So click that notification bell, stay with us for future investigations, and thank you for being part of this journey into the heart of true crime.